Everyone, if you'd please take your seats. Today we have with us Ann Heath Wiersma. Many of us know him as Gordon Wiersma's wife, but she is more than that. She has a professional life of her own. She earned a BA in art history in German from the University of Maine, a Master of Arts in History of Art and Criticism from Florida State University, and a PhD in History of Art and Architecture from Brown University. She's been teaching art history at Hope College since 2007, where she chairs the Art and Art History Department. In addition to teaching Introduction to Art History, she has taught medieval, Islamic, Renaissance, and Baroque art and architecture. Her specialty is Gothic architecture and its role in creating spaces for worship, political power, and social identity. She has worked on archaeological excavations in Italy and France and conducted extensive archival research in France, supported by various foundations, including the National Endowment for the Humanities. A recent essay based on her research is titled Circulating Among Friends, The Raising of Lazarus and the Cult of the Holy Tear at the Abbey of La Trinité in Vendôme, France. Published in a volume of essays she edited with a colleague at George Washington University titled Art, Architecture, and the Moving Viewer, around 300 to 1500, Unfolding Narratives, published by Brill Publishers in 2022. She has 2 additional articles on the Holy Tear coming out in 2023 and 2024. So welcome, Ann Heath Wiersma. She prefers that you hold your questions and comments toward the end, and she'll allow plenty of time for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Judy, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out this morning to hear me talk about my research. I extended an invitation to both my children to come, and as you can see, neither of them have taken me up on that, so thank you for coming. I really appreciate being able to share with you what I'm working on. So first, I think I've got my presentation divided into a few sections, and so I've got my timer on, so when I reach 40 minutes, I promise I will stop talking. But to give you some background, as Judy had pointed out, I did my doctoral work at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and I wrote my thesis on I'm sorry, we're on 2 different slides thing. That's going to be complicated. So, right, I wrote my doctoral thesis on the city of Auxerre in France and its religious communities. And I've written most extensively on this church you see here, the Abbey of Saint-Germain, and the worship practices that surrounded its patron saint, Germanus of Auxerre, who was the 5th bishop of the city. And so I've always been interested in the cult of relics in the community of saints as a belief system. The cult of relics is really, I think, a way of keeping the community of saints alive and present for medieval people while they awaited for the return of Christ. And it really, I think, speaks to the mystery of the incarnation. Jesus himself was very tactile. He was approachable. He was very close to his followers, you know, from the parables, his miracles, his touching and being around people. And so the desire to keep that close at hand was a really important part of medieval worship practice and belief. And so I just have a little slide here to talk about a relic. Comes from the Latin reliquare, and just is the remains, the physical remains of saintly people. Jesus, of course, the Virgin Mary, but I have them starred because according to Catholic belief, Jesus and Mary, they assumed into heaven, so they don't have any bodily remains, but as you can see, there's a little bit of a workaround with that in the Middle Ages. But apostles, martyrs, confessors are people who died a natural death. So martyrs were killed for their faith. Confessors had a natural death. Bishops, kings, queens, anyone who showed great piety were often could be venerated as saints. Or things that they touched, cloth, instruments, oil, those are called brandia. And the idea was that the pars pro toto, a piece of a saint, having a bone, a hair, a fingernail, that would be the equivalent of having the whole intact body. And the idea, if you had a relic in your church, it was like a conduit between heaven and earth. You were closer to heaven. You were in a liminal space between heaven and earth. Miracles were more efficacious, performed by saints' relics. The miracles were performed by, of course, the divine, by God, but they were run through the relic. In the early Middle Ages, usually a cult, and cult just means a practice of worship. It doesn't mean brainwashing or anything like that, but just the practice of worship. Usually it just needed a bishop to approve a cult. People would gather around the remains of somebody and miracles would happen. But then often a vita, or a life, was written about a saint. In the later Middle Ages, it was more of a formal legal process of canonization, which you might be familiar with today. Oh, whoops. It's hard to do this. And so myself, as a student of art history, I've always been interested in objects related to the cult of saints, mostly reliquaries, gold objects like this. But mostly, in terms of what my interest is I'm really interested in the context of understanding these objects in a place. So how they inspired cults, how the built environment created a place for worship. I was interested in how people interacted with reliquaries. What did the physical presence of these objects, what did they do to speak on behalf of the relic? The relic is just, like I said, a piece of bone or a cloth or fingernail. Not that aesthetically pleasing, but then we have these beautiful gold shrines and images. And so what kind of, how did the reliquaries speak on behalf of the relics? And then, of course, how did people engage with them? So, and so that's, as I say, a lot has happened since the Middle Ages. And so to ask these questions take a bit of detective work. And that's what I really love the most about research. I love inspecting buildings very carefully, stone by stone, because a lot of that built environment isn't around anymore. So I really love walking through churches and trying to find evidence of sight lines. What did people see when they were standing in certain places? I like to look for wear and tear on stones to see if I can find patterns of use, where people walked, where they stood, where they kissed things, evidence of lost structures, lost platforms or curtains, anything that can help me reconstruct what an environment might have looked like in the Middle Ages. And then I also love archival work, studying the manuscripts that would help us to understand the liturgy, what was the sound that people heard, what did people chant, what were the stories that they told. I love looking at the relationships between groups of people. You can find that through charters. So I've been really lucky being able to go to France is where I do most of my work. But I've been able to bring students with me and help them engage with this kind of process. I've got Emily Lindblom was with me, and she took some pictures for me. And Jonathan Bading was with me for a few weeks looking at the manuscripts. In France, during the French Revolution, all of the monasteries were disbanded. So the Trinity Abbey right now it's owned by the French government, and it's a parish church. And then all of the manuscripts tend to go to the local libraries. So it's like going to the Herrick Library and taking out all of these medieval manuscripts. And La Trinité is great because its library is mostly intact. It didn't really have a lot of fires to burn the manuscripts, so we have quite a bit of evidence of what they sang, what they chanted during the liturgy. So that brings me to kind of my current project on the Holy Tier at Trinity Abbey in Vendôme. I'm writing a book about it, and as Judy pointed out, I have some articles out. I have a few more coming out 2023 and 24. It takes a really long time to not only get these articles into a shape of publication, to do the research and to write them, but then it takes a long time for them to be published in journals because there's 1 or 2 volumes per year, and they're hard to get into. So it'll take a little bit of time to get them out, but once they do, I'll be very, very happy. So here's a map. So Vendôme, the laser pointer work on this? I should have a little thing, but you can see Vendôme here in the little dot there. So it's about southwest of Paris, between Paris and Tours. And you can see this is what the abbey looked like in an engraving. It was founded by 2 secular people, Geoffrey of Martel and his wife Agnes of Burgundy, who you can see there on your right. They founded the abbey in about 1038, which is late for a monastery, but also during the 11th century, the millennial, there were a lot of people founding monasteries across Europe, so kind of a second wave of monastery founding. So there's a lot going on in France at that time. So Vendôme is that little star there. So when Geoffrey and Agnes founded the abbey, it was part of the dukedom or the territory of Anjou, so Angevin. Geoffrey was the Count of Vendôme, but he belonged to the House of Anjou. It's also allied with the royal territories and the Capetian dynasties, so the French kings had their hand in there. It belonged to the very powerful Diocese of Chartres Cathedral, which was also in the royal domains. Blois was one of the rivals of Vendôme, and so having an abbey kind of near Blois was a way to keep your eye out for the counts of Blois, a little buffer between Blois and Anjou. So it was politically strategic to have the abbey there. And Geoffrey wasn't necessarily supposed to inherit the county of Vendôme, so he sort of took it, and then he planted the abbey there as a way to make his presence there more legitimate. And then his wife, Agnes of Burgundy, she was the widow of William of Aquitaine. And when he died, he had sons from also a previous marriage. And so I think Agnes kind of knew the writing on the wall. She was going to be ousted by her stepson. So marrying Geoffrey was politically expedient because Geoffrey's father, Fulk Nera, was pushed William's territory south and took some territory away. So it was actually a good move on Agnes's part to marry. And again, I should have circled it, but you can see right there that Saintes is one city in the territory of Aquitaine that Fulk had taken. And when they founded Trinity Abbey, Agnes had the relics of Saint Eutrope, who was the bishop of Saintes. And so again, that was a town that Geoffrey's father had taken from William. So I think it was a little bit of a political kind of statement to not only found Trinity Abbey in Vendôme, but also to use the relics of Saint Eutrope as a way to claim political independence from both Aquitaine and Anjou. the abbey was soon after its founding, became very, very powerful. So Geoffrey, when he founded the abbey, he gave it a charter of independence, meaning that it wasn't dependent. The Bishop of Chartres couldn't tell it what to do. The king couldn't tell it what to do, nor could the counts or the dukes of Anjou tell it what to do. They only had to answer to the Pope. So they were a politically independent abbey. And you can see the seal in the front there showing an abbot of La Trinité, or Trinity Abbey. And he's dressed as a bishop. He's wearing a mitre and he has a crozier. But he's showing you that he has the right to wear those things, which is kind of a big deal. And they were also, the abbots of Trinity Abbey were also cardinals of the church. So they had a little place in Rome. Very, very powerful. And you can see also, so make sure I have my notes here. You can see also that they had the money to build a really magnificent church in the Gothic style. There's some of it there's nothing from the original church that was built when Geoffrey and Agnes founded it, but there's some 11th century fabric all the way up to the 16th century. So it was in a state of construction all the time, but you can see they pulled off a pretty impressive building. So one thing that happens sometime between when it was founded and this stained glass in 1295, another relic becomes part of the history of Trinity Abbey. It doesn't appear in any documents until the 12th century, about 100 years after it was founded and 100 years after Saint Eutrope was interred there. But in this stained glass, we begin to see something else. So this stained glass right here, here's a close-up of it. And this little object right here is as you can see, it looks like a piece of crystal being suspended. It's a monk is showing it to 3 pilgrims, and we know that they're pilgrims because the fellow wearing blue there has a little satchel called a script on his side. So he's a pilgrim, and he's kneeling, and they're venerating this object. And so this is kind of circle that there, right there. So this is kind of the crux of the book that I'm writing. I'm interested in, so this relic wasn't there when the abbey was founded. It just appears, and it was known to be the holy tear, a teardrop shed by Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. And so this is what I'm going to be working on right now, is trying to understand how do relic cults develop? Where do they come from? How does one start a relic cult? And then for me, as an art and architectural historian, how does the built environment facilitate the practice of cult? Again, cult just meaning worship practices. So that's a little bit of the background. So I'm going to go into the second part, is how do I do that? How do I begin to answer those questions of understanding the development of a cult, and how does it come out in a spatial context as well as a visual context. So the first is the recovering of the legend of the Holy Tear. So what is this? I told you just now that it's the tear is a teardrop shed by Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. Like, how do we know this, or how do we recover this? So we can read lots of books. I mean, you can go to the library and read about it. Scholars will tell you about this legend, but where exactly does it come from, and where does it start? And so in the library in Vendôme, you can look at a manuscript. And this little prayer here kind of gives us the crux of the legend. So this little prayer tells us that Jesus, when he called Lazarus from the tomb, it was collected by an angel. And then Mary, the Magdalene, brought it to Saint Maximo. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And then it was carried to the Greek emperor and presented it to Geoffrey of Vendôme, who carried it to this place, to Vendôme. So we know something about this holy tear. It comes from Lazarus. was given to Mary Magdalene, given to St. Maximus, carried then to the Greek emperor who had been in Constantinople, and then Geoffrey brought it. Oops, sorry, 2 screens, difficult. So we can sort of learn a little bit more about that in this drawing. So this drawing is in Paris at the Department of Prints and Photography. And it's a drawing from 1695 by a man named Louis Boudon. And what he's drawing was a shrine, a stone shrine that was built in the abbey in the early 13th century that gives us a visual picture of this legend. So the first part of the legend, of course, is the miracle of the Holy Tear. So you can see, I guess this doesn't have a laser pointer, but I have a laser pointer. Hang on. That doesn't, or is it this? No?
The screen reflection will prevent a pointer from working. Would you like a stick? Would you like a stick?
Sure, or, yeah. Sorry, I don't have control of my screen. But as you can see, and I can't, well, I guess I can just go like this. I'll just go like this. So here you can see the drawing of the sculpture. Here we have Jesus, and here's Lazarus. So he's told Lazarus to raise from the tomb. Lazarus is sitting up. And so this is Mary Magdalene. In medieval exegesis, Mary Magdalene is identified as Mary of Bethany, so she's a sister of Lazarus. And so the angel is collecting the tear and giving it to Mary Magdalene, his closest follower. Then we know that Mary gave it to St. Maximus. Just hold on to that thought for a moment. And then we know that the Holy Tear somehow appears in Constantinople. So Constantinople, where the Byzantine emperor was. Constantinople was fabled in medieval lore for having the most precious and most prestigious relics in Christendom. So lots of the treasury of the emperor had relics of the Holy Cross, the True Cross. It had relics of stones from the Holy Sepulchre. So it was really famous as being a treasure trove of biblical relics of the Virgin Mary, for example. So here's Geoffrey being invited into the treasury because Geoffrey had driven the Muslims out of Turkey. So he was offered as a gift of thanks some of the most precious relics that the emperor had. This cleric is whispering to Geoffrey that the emperor's holding back, that actually the most precious relic is still in the treasury. And so Geoffrey says, no, I think I'd actually rather have the Holy Tear that I understand that you have. And so the emperor gave it to him. Here's Geoffrey carrying it back to France and then giving it to the abbey. Here's the abbot again, dressed in his mitra, being given the Holy Tear, and then it's being placed on the altar while the choir boys are ringing the bells to show its presence there. So that's the legend. Now, again, where does that come from? Legends don't come out of nowhere. They usually come out of traditional things. And so here's that tradition of where Jesus, down in Jerusalem, shed his tear for Lazarus, gave it to Mary Magdalene. There's other legends that are swirling around in the 12th century that develop in the 11th and 12th century that talk about how after Jesus had ascended into heaven, Mary Magdalene and her companions, her sister Martha, her brother Lazarus, but also one of the 70 disciples of Christ, Maximus and Sodinus, they were exiled from the Holy Land. They were put on a rudderless boat and sent to their death across the Mediterranean. But that plot was foiled, and they end up arriving on the shores of southern France in Marseille. And Lazarus becomes the bishop of Marseille. Maximus becomes the bishop of Aix in Provence. And Mary, she also preaches, and then she lives in a grotto outside of Provence where she is raised by angels on the canonical hours so that she could hear the angels singing, and she doesn't receive any food until she finally receives communion on the day that she dies. So these are really important legends. So this idea that Mary Magdalene gave the Holy Tear to Maximus is, or let me back up. Obviously the tomb of Lazarus, that's in the Gospels, it's in the Gospels of John. So that has a biblical origins. But then the idea that she gives it to Maximus and takes it to France somehow is part of a whole network of medieval legends that, again, desire to bring the Bible closer to them. So that's why these legends of Mary and Lazarus arriving in France develop. Oops. And then we don't hear too much about Maximus, but he he goes to Constantinople, probably because they're mixing him up with a different Maximus, but that's a different story. And then the second part of that legend has that Maximus then brings, let's get rid of that arrow, Maximus brings the Holy Tear to Constantinople at some point. And then Geoffrey Martel brings it back to Vendôme. And again, that is part of another network, a series of legends, mostly related to the Crusades. So the Crusades that started in the 12th century when secular people, counts and dukes and princes, they're eager to go to the Holy Land to bring back, again, relics, pieces of the True Cross, for example. So this is a reliquary in Toulouse that was given to the Abbey of Saint-Sernin that had a piece of the True Cross. But I think more specifically, this is related, the story of Geoffrey Martel bringing the Holy Tear back to Vendôme is very much inspired by another important set of legends, in addition to the Crusade legends of Charlemagne. If you've heard of Charlemagne, the Chasson de Roland, he was a Frankish king who drove the Saracens out of Spain, the Saracens meaning the Muslims. He was also, he did a lot of reforms of the church. The Carolingian era is named after Charlemagne. But anyway, there's another set of narratives, of legends that talk about Charlemagne going to, he's being invited by the Emperor of Constantinople. He's asked to go to Jerusalem to free Jerusalem from Muslim takeover. And then he is also invited to Constantinople to bring, to be given some of the most precious relics that the Byzantine emperor has. And so this is an image in Chartres, in the Diocese of Chartres, where right next to Vendôme, there's a whole stained glass cycle that depicts the movement of Charlemagne donating these relics that he had gotten from Constantinople. He gives them to Saint-Denis, but it's depicted right next door to Vendôme in the stained glass there. So kind of recovering these legends then have taken me to a lot of different places to figure out where do these legends come from, what is the visual culture around the legends. So of course Paris has a lot of important documents, both documents that I'll talk about in a moment relating to the Holy Tear, but again, that drawing of the shrine is in Paris. I've gone to Avalon and Autun to, not only was Mary Magdalene an important figure in French history, but so is Lazarus. He, like I said, he was the bishop of Marseille, but then his relics get moved to Avalon and Autun, and they also have shrines for Lazarus. Then I have gone to Blois. Even though Blois was the rival of Vendôme, the Counts of Blois were a terrible menace to the abbey. But after the Revolution, a lot of the archival, Blois is the department of which Vendôme belongs to, so a lot of the archival evidence is in Blois. And then I've gone up to Oxford because there's more manuscripts that seem to float away and have gone to Oxford. This is a manuscript that also depicts that legend that I just described to you in rhymed verse. So lots of different pieces that you have to bring together to figure out the legend, where it comes from, why it was there, why did the Abbey invent it. But I think it's part of the network of legends that we're forming. Now, my time. Going back to the Holy Tear itself, so once kind of begin to understand the history, the story that the monks projected about this relic, it's now time to figure out the relic itself, like what was this object? It, like many things, doesn't exist anymore. It lasted until the 19th century. It's like we got so close, but just the 19th century was a terrible time for things. A lot of things got taken down then. So we have this evidence, right? So we know it may have been some kind of glass or crystal ball that was suspended from a chain. And so this is where we have to, again, dig a little bit further into the archival record. This is a document. Most of this stuff is early modern, 18th century, after the Revolution, when the monastery was disbanded. The notaries and the bureaucrats would come in and they would inventory everything that was in the abbey. And so we have this little piece of evidence, this little writing that talks about the armoire, that shrine I was telling you, but then it says that it was contained, the largest of these reliquary covered with tiers of gold. They found 3 other reliquaries of solid gold. And the 2 largest were enriched with precious stones and contained 2 smaller reliquaries. And one of the 2 is the Holy Tear. The Holy Tear is contained in a piece of crystal decorated in gold with 2 chains and 2 rings of the same material. So maybe pretty close to what that might be. And then in Paris, there's another inventory that talks about all of the different things that they found in the abbey. In the bottom of the page there, it says the 2 vessels in which the Holy Tear is enclosed with 2 chains of gold, 2 rings, and 2 pieces of crystal. It weighs 10 ounces and 6 gross, like maybe pounds. So we have some textual idea of what it might be. Of course, most of it contradicts each other, so it's never really easy. But it could look something like this. So it could be something like these rock crystal amulets. That might explain the gold rings that it's around it, so something to entrap the crystal that way. There's some evidence that it was enclosed in 2 internesting vessels, so maybe it was in a rock crystal fatimid ewer like this one, and then the little round object was inside of that. But importantly, though, the fact that it might be crystal is significant. So part of what I work on is materials. So it's not coincidental that so we know that the Holy Tear was a drop of water embodied into this crystal vessel of some sort. And we know from some later evidence that the tear was visible, like you could see it moving within this amulet, for example. So crystal comes from the Greek crystallis, which is the word for ice. And crystal has a really important sort of history in itself. So the 1st century Roman author, Pliny the Elder, talked about rock crystal was formed from moisture from the sky falling as pure snow. The 4th century poet talked about, or Lactantius talked about describing the fountain of life, that there's a fountain in the midst, and the fountain of life, they call it, crystal clear, gently flowing, rich in its sweet waters. Some scholars think that the Holy Tear was, because it was a crystal with a visible drop of water inside it, it might have been what's called an anhydros. The 5th century Roman author Claudian talks about this type of crystal, describing it And anhydrous crystal, he calls it a freak of winters, more precious by reason of its incomplete crystallization, for that the jewel contains within itself living waters. So you can see there's a whole tradition of crystal being related to purity, being related to water, being mysterious. So it comes as no surprise that medieval theologians like Gregory the Great likened crystal to Christ. For example, Gregory the Great said, because through the glory of his resurrection, he recovered from his own corruption the virtue of incorruption. He, as it were, hardened in the manner of crystal from water, so that this is the same nature was in him, and the mutability of corruption was no longer where it had been. So Jesus' human nature was like water, but his perfected nature was like crystal. The 9th century monk Herabnus Maurus talked about crystal. Also because it is made from water into ice and precious stone, it depicts the grace of baptism. Our Redeemer's body, since it lay in suffering unto death, was similar to water. Being born and growing, becoming tired, hungry, and thirsty, and dying, it passed changing through the moments of time until its passion. Water is therefore changed into crystal when the infirmity of the body's corruption is changed into the strength of incorruption through the resurrection. So crystal was the most precious material, and Thomas Aquinas actually said that Christ's relics should only be enveloped in crystal and gold because those are the only materials worthy of Christ. So we don't know, but it seems that the holy tear being made of crystal, having a visible water, it itself, as an object itself, it spoke to the dual natures of Christ, his humanity entrapped and imprisoned into the perfected nature of crystal, which speaks to the story of Lazarus, right? When Jesus calls Lazarus from the tomb, he reveals his divinity within his humanity. So finally, I've got time to give you how did this work together in the Abbey? So we know that they had this relic. It was probably a piece of crystal with water. We know that it came to the Abbey. It was authenticated because it was rooted in the gospel, and then it comes out of these Mary Magdalene and Crusader legends that sort of gave a believable story of how it arrived intact into the Abbey. And so how did people engage with it? How did a pilgrim like the one in the stained glass recover to it? So part of what I work on is I look at the Abbey itself. This is a floor plan that shows here's the floor plan. I guess here's the same floor plan. So we know that so here's the shrine. So here, this area here is where the shrine was located. And we know with those blue arrows, if I take this away, the blue arrows, we know that people came through that north corridor of the Abbey Church. And when they came in, they would have seen this stained glass. So this stained glass on your left here is that north corridor, and the glass is really visible. Through more research, the glass that's there right now was later. Again, in the 19th century, the French were fighting the Germans, and they had a battle kind of near Vendôme, and a cannon went off and destroyed the glass. So it's replaced. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that a stained glass image was in its place. This is a stained glass that's from a different location in the Abbey. And it shows that miracle of the Holy Tear. It shows Christ in blue. I know it's hard to see. In blue is raising Lazarus, who's rising from his tomb. And you can't see it, but there's an angel coming down with a crystal vase to capture the Holy Tear. So when people walked in the Abbey, that's probably what they saw. And then they could have, where the circle is there, they could have circulated around the Chapel of Mary Magdalene that had two other stained glass images of Mary and Martha asking Jesus to come to the tomb of Lazarus, and then, of course, the raising of Lazarus. And then finally, after they turned, they would have come across something that looked like this. So this is from the 16th century. So again, it's a chronology, one piled upon the other. But they would have stood here, and through those little doors, they would have encountered the Holy Tear. It would have been suspended by those chains. They would have been able to come literally face to face with Christ's own tear. A gift that was given to Mary Magdalene because Christ approved of Mary's her compunction and he forgave her of her sins. She was also known as the sinner who washed the feet of Jesus at the house of Simon, and so Christ was pleased with her tears, and so he kind of offers a tear back to her. And so when they would stand at this place, they would look up and they would see exactly what we've been looking at, the stained glass of showing the Holy Tear, the pilgrim kneeling in worship, desiring to see the object itself. And so they would have been part of this whole environment of network, speaking to the offering of the tear, Christ's raising of Lazarus, the gift of the tear being a metaphor for Christ's forgiveness of humanity that would then be perfected on the day of judgment. So let's see. So that's where I am. Oh, 39:21. Look at that. Almost perfectly timed. So that's kind of where I am. Sorry, I have to go forward to see if I have any closing remarks, but because I'm on a different screen. There we go. So that's what I'm working on right now. That's what I'm building the book on, is to describe the. Could you do that hot link? There we go. So a lot of this that I've shown you, a lot of these documents are on a website that I'm building that will be a companion to the book. If you could scroll down. So I just have one page of this, but you can see that this is a chant manuscript that has the office of Lazarus, that describes the story of Christ raising Lazarus. And if you keep scrolling down, my student and I, Jonathan Bading and I, we transcribed the office and then we translated it. And then if you could go down to that antiphona, or yeah, that one right there, perfect. Jonathan recorded what's on the, if you could click it. Because if you're going to reconstruct the environment, you have to reconstruct the sound. You want to play that.
O quam venerandus es egregiae dilecta Dei Lazare.
You can kind of see the translation that he's singing, but these are one of the opening prayers to the Mass to the office of Lazarus. But you can see Lazarus also was Middle Age is considered a sinner, and so the gift of the Holy Tear is a gift of forgiveness, a washing away of sin. Okay, but that's good. You can stop that now. So I'll take questions, but this is my work in progress of understanding, again, the Holy Tear, what it was, where it came from, and what did it mean for people.
Robert, you will make the announcement about recording?
The adult Ed ministry team wants to remind us that we are live and we are being recorded for future availability. So what we say is for the wider public, not just for those of us here in this room. So that's just a word of reminder.
2 questions to begin with. What languages did you have to know in order to read these manuscripts?
Okay.
First question.
Great question. Mostly Latin. Well, Latin to understand the primary, Latin and French to understand the primary sources. Old French. German, because a lot of the literature is always in German, so you have to know that. So French, Latin, German. But that's easy compared to the paleography. Learning how to read handwriting is the hardest language of all. But I've been told, and it is true, the first 10 years are the hardest, and then it gets easier after that.
So, Dave Myers, and just to follow up on Judy's question, and before we dig into the meat of this, would you want to share a little more of your story? How did you come to be interested in art history? And then, how did you come to be interested in medieval art history?
That's a great
And then
question.
define this place. I'd just like to know a little how, take us way back.
Yeah, that's a very good question. My parents are musicians. Many of you know them, so it's not like art was part of me growing up, but it was always music. I think it probably, if I'm taking you way back, and just go like this when you want me to speed up, or go like this when you want me to wrap up that story. You know, I was a kid. I wasn't the greatest of student. I wasn't the great student at all, but I was kind of a dreamy, spacey kind of kid. But if there's something I latched onto, then I really latched onto it. So horses, for example, had a paper route, rode my bike 5 miles to the stables. And my parents took me on a trip to Europe, and that was my first exposure to German, because I grew up in Maine, so French was the big language, just like Spanish is the language here, but French was there, and it didn't really grab me so much. We went to Germany, we went around Europe, and my first exposure to German. And then my parents committed the ultimate betrayal as they bought a house in the rival town. There's no school of choice back then. So I had to go to this new high school, and I hated it, but they offered German there, so I took German. And that was a small class of kind of nerdy kids that were really into it. And the teacher was this Danish woman, but she was like old Europe, and I just fell in love with her. I just thought she was the coolest thing ever. So I started college as a German major. But then in college, you have less people that are less into it. And also, it started to get more hardcore grammar and literature. That wasn't really my thing. I really love, and high school language teachers know this, it's as much cultural history as it is linguistic history. So I missed the culture part. And so I heard about this major called art history. Didn't know anything about it, and I signed up sight unseen. And then I spent a year in Salzburg. So I was a double major, German art history, and I spent a year in Salzburg. And I sang in the choir. I always was a church kid. I liked ritual. I don't know. I just always liked ritual. Like I was the one that wanted to go to church. And we went to church based on how good the music was. And so church for me was always a music-filled, ritual-filled place. And even though I wasn't able to articulate it in that way, I loved procession. I loved choir robes, candle. I loved all of that stuff. And so I sang in the choir in Salzburg, which is always a full Latin mass orchestra. It was amazing. So I think just environment, the environment. And then I thought medieval art was I liked medieval architecture. I thought Gothic architecture was cool because you could identify the buttresses and stuff. But I thought the art was really strange. I didn't know it, and I didn't like it. But when I came home, I took a class on Northern Renaissance, which is really late medieval. And again, that was my first introduction to like medieval theology, the idea of typology, that the Old Testament is interpreted in the light of the New Testament. I just thought that was the most fascinating thing I'd ever heard of. And then like medieval art isn't just the Bible story, but like I said, it's a prefiguration, and it has images paired with the Old Testament, and it has writings of Augustine and Gregory. I just thought that was just so incredible, so interesting. And so that's how I ended up with that. And then at Florida State, I studied with Cynthia Hahn, who was very much into the object and reliquaries. And she's very creative. And, you know, medieval studies, because we don't have a lot of authorship, so we don't study art in terms of who did what. But especially American art historians, I think, use theory. They use linguistic theory. They might use like social network theory. I just loved American scholarship. It's very creative, theory-driven, which I don't know, I just like that. And then when I studied with Sheila Bond at Brown, she's very much, I learned so much from her. Archaeology, she taught me how to use archives. I wanted to go to Brown because I loved the theory that I learned at Florida State, but I wanted to be a good scholar. And when you read the scholarship, you realize that those people, they weren't reading, obviously we read other people's scholarship, but their arguments were always grounded in archival stuff. So I wanted to be that. And so that's why I went to Brown, and that's where I studied Latin and French. And so I really got great training. And that's what I love. I just love, I see that these are like puzzles, and I just love putting the puzzle pieces together. And headache sometimes, but there is a real thing. Tears in the Archive is a real thing, and but that's why they have 2-hour lunches. You go home, have a good cry, and come back.
Another question, and this is the application to our own world here. I'm wondering, it set me thinking, does Hope Church have any relics? And in some ways, relics are things that bring us back to our origins in the East. And I think that Philip Phelps brought with him a chandelier that was once in a church in New York, and it was once in the post office, I believe, in New York, and then it was hung in our church before the fire. It was rescued from the fire, and he had it in his office at one point in the Van Vleck Hall. So that would be one relic. I have no idea where it is now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another relic is, I think, a gift that was given to us from a church in Albany, and that's the rooster that's on our steeple. Those two things, I think, are our relics, and they bind us back to the East, the church in the East. And
Absolutely.
feel free, anybody else, to add to that.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that brought me to Hope Church, the reason why I walked into its doors in the first place, was the architecture, and then what kept me here was the music, the liturgy, the environment that's created. So probably not so much the sermons, but the fact that you have a liturgical year, it changes over time. The decorations change, the music changes, the vestments change, and I think that's all meaningful. It's important, I think, even though we're Protestants and medieval past, but there is something transcendental about communal worship, and we come to places because we want to be moved. And intellectually, you can read the Bible, and you can do Bible studies and book studies, but there's a sensory aspect of it that I think it's really important to, again, connect us to the past, our own traditions. It connects us to the year, the cycle. It connects us to our parents, our own histories. I first tried to go to Grace Church, and it's lovely too, but the hymns weren't the hymns I grew up with, and so it had less resonance with me because I wanted to sing the kind of hymns that I sang my own churches growing up. So there is something that connects us beyond ourselves that's important.
I'm Dan Griswold. Thank you, Ann. This is really stimulating. And it seems that a lot of what you researched was seeking to uncover how observers, how parishioners in that cathedral might have experienced the artwork, the architecture as they walked in. In your research, did you find any evidence of how the artists themselves were engaged in that and what they might have been intending to do, what they might have been thinking, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
No, for my case, no. We don't really know. We don't even have the works of art themselves practically. We don't really have much for the artisans. That's a really hard thing to find in the Middle Ages. There's some snippets, but There's a few manuals, artist manuals. We don't necessarily get the artist's, what he or mostly he, but sometimes she thinks. But we do have some manuals about how to make things. We can kind of access an artist agency that way. Sometimes we know the names. Sometimes, and mostly we know, it'll just say, Giselbertus made me. That's all we have. And so, but that's probably why I like the Middle Ages too. We're actually not roped into the artist. We're forced to start to ask other questions that I find interesting. And reception theory, like understanding what a viewer might have seen or thought, is something fairly new. Well, I guess now 30 years is not so new anymore, but when I was going through graduate school in the 90s, that was understanding viewer perspective was something that was pretty present in medieval studies.
I'm David Alexander. I want to jump a continent, a religion, and a millennium. We were present in Taiwan when at a large abbey, you might call it Buddhist abbey, Buddhilite Mountain in the same county where we lived, acquired a Buddha's tooth sometime in the late 90s. And the crowds of people who descended on this place to see this little brown nugget, which was supposed to have been the tooth of the Buddha, like the tear of Christ,
Yeah.
same kind of phenomenon, still in this century, in the world we live in now, in the living memory of people, we see it.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
I want to tell you a story about being married to an art historian. So we went to Fenway Park in Boston, and then we were in the gift shop where you can buy thousands of things for thousands of dollars. But what you can buy is a little packet in which is contained dirt from the infield.
Game
And
dirt, guaranteed
game
to have
dirt,
been played
that
during a game.
actual game dirt. And people pay a lot of money to get that little packet. And I found that interesting, and Liam, our son, did, but Ann said, you know what that is, don't you? That's a touch relic. That's a relic that people want to have a piece of the experience
also
that
buy
they take with
shirts.
them. Yeah, you
could-
could take a piece of cloth.
A little piece
So,
of shirt.
as a Protestant person, some of these things I've learned to, it sounds like it's a different sort of sound with the Holy Land relics and that kind of thing. But when you see what's the experience that people are having, you see the stories that move in around it, and then you start to see all around you, people are looking for these experiences. People have these things.
Yeah, I think we all have one. Think of a place you've always wanted to go to and what it felt like to be at that place, and you wanted to take something with you to remind you. Or if you've ever gone to see a person, a person you didn't know personally, but maybe a celebrity or an athlete or a speaker or intellectual, going to see somebody has an excitement and a meaning to it.
Sorry, this is Emily. I am wondering if in this age of where that viewer perspective maybe is from Instagram, right, it has this experience of reliquaries and relics been introduced into that new field. I'm thinking specifically of Instagram posts or some media posts where people are unpackaging things and touching them venerantly and enjoying them. Right, there's this like impartation of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, is that happening with relics?
Well, the Holy Tear, people it was known for curing the blind, particularly if you could touch your eyes on it, if you could hold the Holy Tear up to your eyes. It is famous for curing blindness, but people wanted to touch them. I think that's why they had that little contraption there, because they had to control it because people would try to take it. There's all kinds of stories of showing the true cross, and people would try to take a bite out of it when they kissed it, so they had to put guards up. So yeah, there was a desire to touch it. And so some relics are never, So most of them, those reliquaries, often are protective. I mean, they keep the relics safe. Sometimes they're exposed on certain days. It open them up, but you have to really be careful with them because you didn't want people touching them or breaking off pieces and stuff like that. But the tactile, there is definitely, when you see something, there is a tactile desire to touch them or to hold them, kiss them.
So a question you're probably going to hate, but I'm sure you are familiar with. Has there been carbon dating or DNA analysis attempting to authenticate relics or date them?
Oh, yeah.
And secondly, help us make sense of what the claim is about the tear, because the actual tears of Jesus would have quickly evaporated or dried. So
Right. Well, so I'll guess the second part. So as I said, Jesus doesn't have any physical remains, right? The whole miracle is the tomb is empty. But there are relics of Jesus, baby teeth, for example, the foreskin, and then the tear. So it's a bodily relic, but one that could ostensibly be shed before one assumed. But it's an important part of the story, the legend, is that the angel immediately captured it. So he was weeping, he calls Lazarus from the tomb, and then there's an angel right there to collect it from its cheek before it could be evaporated. And that's why, in some ways, there's a later poem about it, but like the fact that it's visible within its imprisoned case, I think, is trying to say that we have captured it. And it has to be, it's the subject of a forthcoming article. The relationship between the crystal and the tear is unique because the tear can't exist without the crystal, because therefore it would evaporate. So it's the relic, the crystal that encases it is an integral part of the relic, more so than bones being contained in a thing. If you could go back to my presentation real quick. But your question about, so you can see in the 19th century, everything in the 19th century, I can't go fast enough, but one of the early slides that I showed you of this little box thing, can get that? Can you like that second or third one, the box where I had that slide about the cult of relics?
we remember it.
Yeah, so you see there's like all these little relics and there's like these little slips of paper. So like, especially in the 19th century, it happens, one of the ways we can date, not the object itself, but when it became a relic, is like often a bishop would authenticate a relic, and he'd put a little slip of parchment to say, I Bishop Heinricus, venerate this. But then in the 19th century, a lot of them are reopened and re-inspected, and that's a pig knuckle, so that's not authentic. But this one is a finger bone. So there was like a desire to try to do some kind of authenticating as much as possible, but obviously I don't think there has been any DNA testing that you can actually say this is so-and-so's finger bone, but it's the finger bone.
But you can date it with carbon dating.
Yeah, and usually carbon dating is, I guess, dendrochronology is just for wood. I don't know if how much they've done that. Usually I think they have more of a terminus postquem, like we know the date that it was put into this reliquary box, 14th century, something like that.
Thank you, Anne. This was absolutely fascinating. Yep, I'm back here.
Oh,
thank you.
Oh, there you are.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
having me. Yeah, appreciate it.
Amazing. Yep. In our one trip to France, and we went in several cathedrals, I remember, just like you were pointing out, looking down at the stone or the tile floor, and you see the wearing, and it's like all the feet that have gone there over, it's amazing.
It is.
And
Yeah.
when Gordon talked about the dirt, I was reminded at the Legacy Museum, where Patty was also just recently, with the dirt that has been collected from the various sites of the lynchings
Yeah.
that's on display there. And people are
It has
just
meaning, yeah.
silent before that. It's just, it's a powerful experience. Thank
Yeah,
you
thank you.
very, very much for
Thank you so
today.
much.
Fascinating. Next week is our last session of Adult Ed until we do General Synod Review in the last Sunday in June. But next week, now how many of you saw the bicycle band? Did you see that? The amount of coordination that took? Well, I don't think Dan is going to ride a bicycle around next week. But Dan Griswold is going to present, and you can read more about this on page 13. How can I keep from singing musical metaphors for the Christian life? And Dan says, music may help us creatively envision ways we may follow Christ that are holistic, embodied, and faithful. I look forward to that discussion next week. Thank you, Dan, and thank all of you. We'll see you next week.